Hello, so today we go back on Byzantine history, which I'm always glad to do because, Byzantine history is always perceived as a sort of absence, historiographically speaking, of which today, obviously, historians are aware. The same Byzantinists created this term. The idea that, however, in spite of of ideological problems that surrounded the idea of the so-called Byzantine Empire, you can understand that from this very name that has no historical base whatsoever. In the time in which the the Roman Empire existed, there is also an inherent problem to the sheer quantity of talking, of writing around the Byzantine world. This happens for many reasons. There is surely a linguistical distance from Greek. The few Westerners that study Greek, they're actually learning ancient Greek in their schools, and medieval Greek and modern Greek are not studied, and this makes, obviously, even from a statistical point of view, quite difficult to find someone who knows how to read Byzantine sources. Another problem which is related not just to Greek Byzantine history but also to Balkanic history as a whole, and even of Eastern Europe in general, is the problem of even finding the sources. It's plenty of sources in countries like, for instance, Bulgaria or others that are still there in the monastic libraries, and that could be, could really make possible a rewriting of of local history. In Bulgarian history, by the way, is very important also for the Byzantine one, as you probably already know. But who's gonna go there? Who's gonna go into a Bulgarian monastery or even a Greek monastery and finding books and having the competencies to read those medieval writings in use at that time, or even the same language? So I think that any good, it's always positive to talk as much as possible about Byzantine history and about all those histories that have been sort of neglected, or at least partially um, partially forgotten, even in our Western European, at least, perspective. That is indeed a shame, we can say, historically speaking. And today I would like to introduce a topic that, as you read from the title of this video, is about the causes of the so-called iconoclasm. Iconoclasm, I think it's self-explanatory as a term, but just in order to avoid misunderstandings, it simply means the destruction of the images. And we are referring to a moment in Byzantine history that is very obscure from a source point of view. Iconoclasm started essentially in the 8th century. So in the Byzantine East, in the West, and both in West and the East, there was a sort of recovery from, the the decline that had taken place from a demographical, economical, cultural point of view in the previous centuries. But still, we don't have many sources, so it's very difficult to even look at them and to being able to interpret them properly. Plus, Byzantine history in itself has one additional obstacle to the understanding of this story because the Byzantine world was quite different from others that we can look at that time. Surely the Byzantine world was quite advanced and for those times, but differently from Western Europe, there were probably less free sources that you can find. Western Europe was fragmented, for instance, which, if anything, unavoidably produced many diversified point of view. For instance, doesn't matter how propagandistic these works and sources are, they still can be confronted, and you can't see this variety of the West. Byzantine Europe instead was in fact a whole block, a whole state, and a real state, not like in the West, in our Latin Germanic West, when the centralized structures were quite weak. Indeed, even the Byzantine Empire had gone, as we were saying, undergone a decline and transformation. But the idea of a centralized state with an emperor, with a centralized church, with a centralized administration, was always standing in this period. And this meant that the sources that were produced were dominantly, if not exclusively, produced from an imperial point of view, an imperial propaganda, and plus these were always oriented according towards a certain historiographical, or at least literary models that weren't really quite versed for critical thinking or objective observation of the real society of that time. They were conceived in order to aiming to depict in a certain sense that order that the Roman Empire was meant to address to the world. So there was a very few a very few diversification of the nature of sources. Historians always looked at the classical heritage, the classical legacy, and historiographical tradition and Christian historiographical tradition to express certain concepts, and that was their aim, because the Byzantine Empire was founded from that point of view on a sort of perpetuation of the ecumenical order that had been sanctioned since the times of Constantine, of Theodosius, of Justinian, and it was with great difficulty capable of creating something different. Obviously, I'm a bit of making a sort of an extremization from this point of view, because also Byzantine history and shows how even the same literary models were quite vital, but in this very moment of history, there were a lot of factors that make that make our sources very very difficult to look at, and they have always to be read, and trying as always to be read from that particular context and perspective. And I'm talking about the causes of iconoclasm. Not talking about iconoclasm in itself from a merely historical evidential point of view. I will be doing that in some other video on occasion, because the topic is very vast in spite of all, and it requires a lot of talking. But I'm just focusing on the causes, the legitimate question of why did iconoclasm come up in the Byzantine world, and why especially in this specific context that, as we will be seeing, is very peculiar. The empire of iconoclasm is the empire of Leo III, Byzantine emperor from 717 to 741, a great figure, in Byzantine history for many reasons. However, that that we have to address from these religious policy point of view in here. And we're talking about an empire that had suffered greatly since the previous century of the Arab invasions. There were a lot of, the Byzantine Empire shrank, against the Arab invasions, and settled on a more restricted territorial area. However, we must say that exactly thanks to its state organization, it always had a great responsive capacity against external threats, and politically and military speaking, it worked pretty well. However, at the same time, these changes, these wars, this instability in ultimate analysis brought to the weakening of the empire, and incidentally to different transformations that occurred in many lands, not just the ones that for instance were lost by the empire to other enemies, which weren't just the Arabs at this point, but also within the same Byzantine regions. And we're talking about the same empire that faced at the beginning of the 8th century the famous Arab siege that was repulsed, also thanks to the very powerful imperial fleet, and thanks to the same Leo III. That was the beginner of a dynasty within the imperial within the Byzantine imperial history of the so-called Isaurians. Isauria is a region in Asia Minor. However, the true origins of the Isaurian dynasty were Syrian. This tells you also, by the way, how in this system that the Byzantines had created that seems so crystallized and unchangeable, actually there was a lot of change also in terms of who could reach the imperial throne. In this sense, a dynasty that wasn't even Greek in origin. That also tells you much about Byzantine multiculturalism, and in the frame of this universal empire, that there was an empire mostly from a Christian point of view and from a juridical point of view, but that didn't care after these two major elements where people came from. Obviously, also relatively to the times, meaning that obviously local aristocracies were in strong competition, and were cultural differences that created problems and intolerance and discrimination back then, just like today. However, what this Isaurian dynasty carried out was exactly, among the other things, iconoclasm. And these policy was carried out actually pretty violently. And it was aimed to the purification of the Christian cult from those developments that had been judged as idolatric. For some reasons that are the ones we're going to discuss, in fact. And this is very meaningful because you might ask, but why they were really, they had just saved the empire from the Arabs, an external enemy. There was the possibility of regaining soil, of making policies of further expansion. Iconoclasm had instead consequences that brought to an internal weakening of the empire, apparently. And especially in Italy and in Greece, so in the Italian and Greek Byzantine territories, there was a lot of resistance against this religious address that was given by Constantinople, and that obviously created a lot of further instability and more problems. This happened essentially because these local populations were used since centuries to the cult of holy images, the icons, in fact, and felt iconoclasm, so the destruction of these images, as basically intolerable from their point of view, and they saw the same iconoclasm as uh, as a sacrilegious as a sacrilegious act. I mean, the same material destruction of these figures that was being carried out by the central government. And from our modern point of view, we can really start asking ourselves, but which were the causes of this iconoclasm? I mean, what is that? That the Byzantine emperor went nuts at a certain point, decided to impose this destruction against people who venerated, after all, local Christian saints. What was really wrong in that? And why did it cause? And from our modern point of view, it seems, this is the first approach that everyone studying medieval history, and especially Byzantine history, should always bear in mind, that something that seems so not political and eminently religious, like what iconoclasm um, uh, was very extremely political at that time. And we will be saying for which reason in practice, but you have always to bear in mind that there was always a theoretical and very valid reason for the emperors to do something like that, because anything that concerned religion in an empire that was meant to be the Catholic empire per excellence, so the universal, um, exactly etymologically speaking, by Catholic, meaning by Catholic empire of the world, that actually was meant to overlap with the same Christian world, had obviously to address religious affairs, religious policy, as necessarily a strictly political matter. Something that affected the real life, the everyday life, the same functioning of state in many ways. And what is obviously also difficult to understand for us is this intent of purification that had to be achieved through the destruction of the icons. And as we were saying, um, while there had been some sort probably of of problem from the other side. I mean, if we really want to see iconoclasm really only from a religious point of view, there was probably some religious concern. We will be seeing how there were more political concerns, but it should be effectively noted that there had been a wide spread of the cult of the icons. Now think of a world like this of the early Middle Ages, where we give for assumed that everybody was Christian, or that at least those who called themselves Christians were truly Christian from a theological point of view. The idea that everybody believed in the Holy Scriptures, in the Scriptures, Scriptures that really doesn't exist. Holy Scriptures, in the same way, that practice the same rites, and that held essentially the same faith, doctrine, and beliefs. But things were very different from this, actually very far, because it is true that regions like Greece and Italy were some of the oldest Christian lands by evangelization and for development and eradication of rooting of Christian faith. But at the same time, we're talking about a world that came from previous centuries and centuries of polytheism. And we shouldn't think that Christianization had been something so, first of all, so smooth or so uh, efficient and effective at all levels. We have to think of this world, even the most Christian one at the time, as still dominated largely by traditional beliefs and superstitions that really intermingled with Christian belief itself and that were believed to be as such. It wasn't much a matter of believing in superstitions that implied other spiritual figures that weren't really part of the Christian world, but it was really believing that the same Christianity could tolerate and include other forms of believing that as far as we know today were quite heterogeneous in the same Christian world. What did this mean? It means that the same icons were sometimes being more than venerated. I mean, they were believed to be a sort of I can't say idols because then it seems that I'm making a pro-iconoclastic propaganda, but it was typical of a formerly polytheistic world to attach particular meanings and particular powers to certain symbols that could be, I don't know, a holy place, a natural place too, and in this case to icons that were essentially depictions of saints that weren't really conceived from what in fashion we could do today, for instance, in believing that that's a picture of your own saint, you draw that, maybe your own, and then you put it on your wall and you say, oh wow, that's my favorite saint point, and you pray maybe to that saint. In those times it was very different because every icon, and especially the richest ones, those that had even a public you know, to which there was a public access, that were used into local rituals and festivals, were still were meant to be truly something unique and special, in which the same presence of the saint would exist, and maybe touching that or praying to that would make things would make prayers you know, be heard by the saint, would you know, make a miracle for you or stuff like that. This is something you find still in many parts of the Christian world, you know, and you realize that such beliefs are actually even against the same Christian teaching, and that they exist because there is an imperfect knowledge of Christian doctrine in there as well. So I imagine that since the Byzantines were extremely orthodox, and at least I'm talking about the you know, the establishment and the imperial court at Constantinople, and the church that had a very strongly centralized asset in Constantinople at that time, obviously held a knowledge, a theological knowledge, a cultural knowledge broadly meant, that wasn't known even to the same clergy of certain regions of the empire, and this meant that you know, the faithful were quite difficultly could quite difficultly be you know, convinced of the fact that the veneration of that particular icon and the divinity and the sanctity that the picture was a representation in a very vivid and symbolical way, could was false and didn't give actual benefits if you really knew the scriptures and you had a true Christian faith. And you can't think that at that time, however, this was really the problem, because I'm sure that in the same Constantinople where people were supposed to talk about theology seemingly, but there wasn't as well such an awareness of how certain practices um, were not orthodox in many ways, and they could arise suspects, in fact, of heterodoxy or even heresy. Naturally, we always, however, have to understand that in the Christian world, it still tolerated the so-called veneration of a picture, which, as far as I know, means that you can keep with great care and human positive feelings a picture of your own saint, but you don't actually think that that saint can do miracles only for you because you venerate that icon, because that's that stops being veneration and starts being idolatry from a Christian point of view. So if we have to exclude also this religious perspective from the causes of iconoclasm, what was really about this phenomenon, and why was it so important for the Byzantine emperors to even compromise the stability and public order of certain close and distant regions of their dominions? Well, first of all, we have to look at who really held those icons. When we talk about iconoclasm, we don't have to think about the little icons that presumably the Christians brought, even if they were quite poor, of all social classes, maybe with them, like holy relics and stuff like that. But we have to look at those ecclesiastical foundations, especially monasteries in the Byzantine world, that owned such icons that were often associated, in fact, to the local saint, and to all the geography that revolved usually around monasteries. Related to miracles of the saint that performed in that place and so on, and to which the local communities were quite affectionated, because we're talking about a Byzantine society. Byzantine society was a largely agrarian society. Remember when I was talking about polytheism, many of these people really had remained in halfway between paganism and Christianism, and monasteries, in fact, had frequently been built over formerly pagan symbols. There could be shrines or holy places, and there is surely a continuity in the beliefs that the local communities owned relatively to that place. That didn't matter, whether it was pagan or Christian, but the important was that it had remained always that point from a traditional point of view, as it's normal in all societies, and this because people were poorly educated, and they presumably had a very low understanding of saying Christianism. I think that was a sort of catechism that involved at least dogma of Trinity, or or what prayers had to be done and what sacraments were about. But we don't have really to think that these people at that point were true Christians, because they probably believed to be so genuinely. That they surely didn't consider themselves as pagans. They didn't rationalize the thing. The important was that there was this cult that made those magics in a way, and that could assure them a good life um, or a good harvest, or all those things that in small agrarian communities like the majority of the Byzantine Empire was made of, were the norm really, and local monasteries really played much in this. I mean, they convinced the local populations to whom they had a great economical affiliation and even political influence, that particular picture, that particular icon, um, owned certain powers, and that the faith into that icon would, I don't know, grant these people salvation and you know such positive such positive things. Um, and we have to think that monasteries at that time had owned had structured very solid estates. A lot of possessions. They were usually quite wealthy, and especially in those areas of the empire, like it could be Byzantine Italy, and where the central authority was quite the central statal authority was quite weak. Obviously, monasteries were even becoming a sort of political alternative to the statal rule. And we know that that happened in Sicily, it happened in other areas, in Greece as well. So even the you know this this process was seen is obviously understandably a problem for a central authority, and it had to be eradicated in some part. And iconoclasm, from this point of view, however, regains some rationality. It's still a very sad, event, also because it involved a brutal slaughter of opposers, and uh, um, probably less importantly, but still dramatically, to the destruction of many pieces of art that haven't survived to us exactly because they were destroyed, and that were actually a very amazing aspect of those cultures. I mean, visual arts, especially in certain local areas of the Mediterranean, were quite advanced. There were a lot of traditions that existed even among the people, um, and before the same Christianization that lived on through these icons, and that were the witness of a very noble form of art that, however, were eradicated because uh, these communities were forbidden to produce such works. Um, so the idea that the visual art could manipulate in a way the local communities, from a political point of view and also religious point of view, was definitely was concrete. And you also have to think that always relatively to that consideration about the rationality of these beliefs and the rational intent of such a policy, isn't really to be understood to be meant so strongly, because even these monastic centers that has so much power and political power weren't just kind of deluding the local communities just for their own benefits. Surely it was an interest from that point of view, but the worrying thing from the religious Orthodox perspective of Constantinople is that these monasteries were even starting to develop through the icons certain forms of heterodox thinking, mm, and to enrich the these beliefs uh, with actually the local identities. The idea that around the icon itself it wasn't much about the icon in itself, but it was what it meant from the local community, from the local perspective. The idea of having a common history, a common identity, a common language, a common belief, and beliefs that also were rooted in paganism sometimes and in local traditions that were, however, embodied and overruled by these icons that basically managed to make a synthesis of all that in a unique, powerful symbol like that was. From another side, and this is a very fascinating interpretation in explaining the causes of iconoclasm. So, merely, especially after the end, the partial end of the Arab threat, the will from Constantinople to regain power within the same borders of the empire by confiscating all the goods of the monasteries had become too powerful and too distant from the statal order that the emperor and the church were meant to preserve intact. And this is seen by even the consequences of iconoclasm. There was the confiscation of huge monastic estates in many regions of the empire. It's not that different from what Henry VIII did in England with the Supremacy Act and confiscating all these major goods of monks and other Catholics, and causing in fact the Anglican schism, because it was there were quite concrete even trivial reasons. The idea of having of needing money and taking the riches of these organizations. However, there is also another explanation to iconoclasm that doesn't obviously interfere with this first theory, and that probably compenetrates it, and it's evidently and historically researched. That is instead a more not really a more religious explanation, but a more cultural explanation, especially because we have seen the monasteries that were considered, in fact, the cradle, the hub of this spreading of icon idolatry, if we want to call it this way. But from the other side, in the Byzantine Empire, another great system was represented by the bishops, the great bishops that especially ruled in cities. That we've seen there were a few big cities in the empire, but the few that existed had a great power and a great prestige, also from a religious point of view, and also because the Byzantine aristocracy was embodied also by these clergymen, and the bishops in the Byzantine Empire at this period were much more orthodox than monks. It's always been the case also in the West, telling the truth, and it would be so for a long time, because as we have seen, they were in contact with the more in contact with the imperial elites, because obviously from Constantinople, sometimes it was easier to talk to a bishop that to anyone else, in the local administration, because bishops had a huge, um, actual power in local, in managing local policies, and even, especially administrating the cities, which meant the local Christian community of believers of that diocese, and and even feeding them and providing to building and stuff, something that is known very well since the establishment of Christianity as the official religion of the empire, and the progressive decline of lay aristocracy, and the rise of power of these clergymen. And these clergymen, being so close to the imperial elite, were also much more um, orthodox than monks, for this very reason, because they definitely felt a much more intense theological influence from the great figures of the Byzantine Church that were in Constantinople. And at the same time, these people were much more educated, and they were much more aware of the world for this very reason, because obviously cities were centers of trade, and people came from everywhere, and was a major concentration of riches, and therefore aristocracies were wealthier, and there were more pupils that would become bishops that could afford a very high education. So this clergy was much more aware of theological issues, and even aware of other religions, and especially these bishops that lived in Asia Minor and at the court of Constantinople, which were much more exposed to the Muslim and Jewish influences that were quite strong at that time. And not only of those, but also of certain heterodox, let's say, if not radical, Christian currents that really pushed for the preservation of the purity of monotheism from deviation, that this figurative representation of divine or human people seemed to suggest, and therefore we see that it's a bit of a paradox that these Isaurians that had been the great defenders of the empire from the Arabs expressed an iconoclastic intolerance that that was proper of the same Arabs in their own lands, and it has to be read as, telling the truth, as a cultural mediation in some way. They probably so. It's not that they were pro-Arabs or philo-Muslims or something like that, because as we've seen, they had fought and defeated even the same Arabs, but they probably, being smart men as they were, they had seen also what happened in the Arab lands. And they noticed that probably in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, this problem of having sects of local beliefs that were kind of, heterodox, and even pushed for a sort of local political autonomization from the center, weren't there. And that was a great advantage for for a monotheistic religion, like also the Muslim one in fact was. And so we don't have to read in contrast with the the military defense of this empire, the iconoclasm, but on the contrary, we have to see it as a tool that imperial court of Constantinople meant to use as the head of a political and ecclesiastical organism which had a universal meaning. So the idea of creating an order into an empire where everybody had to have the same beliefs, everybody had to be orthodox, cent for cent, or at least in that measure that wouldn't fuel certain autonomistic pushes or other forms of identitarism that were against the central government, and that was a real problem, as we have seen. We have seen, especially, that these problems occurred more in the western part of the Byzantine Empire than the eastern one, that was the most progressed at that time, Asia Minor and Constantinople. They happened in Italy and Greece, that were relatively decentralized regions, and that therefore might also feel a certain, distance from the political ambitions of Constantinople proper. Also, the idea of you don't have to underestimate into this process the idea of uh, of of the differences that there were, for instance, between cities and country aside, because those are crucial. We have seen that this was not just a religious problem, nor even an exquisitely political one. It was socially broadly meant. We have seen that the big cities of the empire were against the big monasteries that were incidentally in the countryside. So it was city against countryside. It was the idea that that from a city like Constantinople, certain communities that had nothing to share with that world um, didn't want to be, to have anything to do with. And because they felt enclosed in their own small world. And that happens in the early Middle Ages, because there are areas that doesn't matter how much part of a trade circuit, how aware of the rest of the world, um, um, but they still retained a quite strong local identity, and especially in areas in which the Byzantine government had failed to make itself felt, particularly to put things in order. And these monasteries probably were seen as a sort of point of reference, like especially in Byzantine Italy. The idea is, those guys in Constantinople are just strangers. They're people who had nothing to share with local populations, that were felt like dominators and nothing else, like foreign rulers and nothing else. This is the same reason why, for instance, certain communities in the East had so easily opened their gates to the Arabs, because probably they saw these guys coming from Arabia, maybe even better than those coming from Constantinople from their own perspective. Obviously, it's very much complicated, where many interests, many political gaining, you can't really explain it that way. But it's important to understand the distances that were felt at that time between areas that even think about communications, these were areas that maybe remained, that received news from Constantinople every once in a while, and then they wouldn't even, nobody from those places would frequently go there, and they were their horizons were much more local than universal, like the ones of the of the ones in Constantinople. So this was a, I hope an interesting video. I will be talking again about the iconoclasm. I think it's very important, and we should discuss it more in depth. All the implications of this phenomenon. As always, if you like this video, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel or write me an email if you have any question. You can even ask me to make a video about a certain topic. I will be glad to do that if I have time. So I thank you for listening, and I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.